Whenever the subject of Sega comes up, you are sure to hear about their failures as a hardware manufacturer. They never had a single platform that did well worldwide, giving the pundits plenty of ammo to talk about. But in this episode, we are putting all that aside and focusing purely on the times that Sega made me really happy. I went back in my 40-year history with the company and pulled 10 times I can recall being genuinely excited Sega had done something that directly affected me. It ranges from little things some of you won't care a lick about, to things that likely affected a great many of you. While this may appear in a top 10 format, I'd like to be clear that the placement is completely at random. I probably could have listed them in order of preference, but I didn't want to minimize them in regards to importance. They all brought great joy to me, and that's all I really wanted to focus on. Let's waste no more time and get right to it. 10 times Sega made me really happy. For years, Sega had some rather interesting takes on the Little Blue Blur. The series had hit some high notes on the Genesis, but then hit a ton of lows afterwards. I didn't care much because I wasn't the biggest fan of Sonic's to begin with, but even I took notice in the drop in quality. Every so often I did appreciate an entry, particularly when they tried to return the IP to its roots. But it was in 2017 when Sega finally did something with Sonic that made me truly happy. They turned him over to the fans. Sonic Mania was a love letter to both Sonic's 16-bit legacy and what it could have been on the platforms that followed. Every sight, every sound, every gameplay segment screamed what this franchise should have been on the Sega Saturn. The foolish notions that Sonic and pals had to be made of polygons to appeal to a modern audience were dispelled in mere seconds once you took control of the flawless gameplay. It became pretty clear to me that this was an avenue that Sega should explore more often. Let the community of talented developers out there take a stab at making your classic and dormant IPs. Sega is sitting on so many of them, we could have a full-on renaissance in no time. During the run of the Saturn, the Sega Sports brand took some nasty turns. Many were late, the quality took some major hits, and some didn't show up at all. This sat in stark contrast to how things had been on the Genesis. Its Sega Sports lineup just kept getting better and better there, so I had some big expectations for them on the Saturn. It wasn't all bad, of course. Sega still had some great baseball titles, and I even enjoyed a few of their golf and soccer games. Lucky for me and every other Sega Sports fan out there, they got back on track fast once the Dreamcast landed in North America. Sega got the MLB, NFL, NBA, NHL, NCAA, and even tennis, soccer, and wrestling ready for its reinvented brand. Best part is that just like the Genesis days, each of these games got better year to year, so you always had something to look forward to with each new entry. Even when Sega abandoned the Dreamcast, the Sega Sports branding kept going strong, kept getting better and better, and blessed the Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo fans out there with multiple great games. Eventually, the Sega Sports brand was so strong, so well received, Sega sold the developers responsible for most of the games. For about 5 years there though, I couldn't have been happier. The 1980s and 90s were a dark time for television connections in the United States. Most of us were stuck with the awful RF box for much of that time, and the lucky ones sporting composite video. When I got my Saturn, I finally got a television that allowed me to use S-Video, and oh my god, what an upgrade that was. This inspired me to want to always get the best connection available for whatever console I had, so when the Dreamcast launched in 1998, the first thing I did was look into how I could connect it the best way possible. This ultimately led me to grab a VGA box when it was released in early 1999. As the name implies, it allowed me to hook up my Dreamcast straight to a VGA monitor, and if you were lucky enough to ever do this, you know the sheer jubilation of the image quality it afforded you. Never had the graphics on my screen been so clear, so colorful, and so without compromise. Seeing games like Sonic, House of the Dead 2, Soul Calibur, and countless others never failed to impress me, and each one was drop dead gorgeous. If you own a Dreamcast and you have never seen it on a VGA monitor, do yourself a favor and do so when you have the means. I guarantee you won't regret it. The excitement of getting my own Sega CD was huge. The Model 1 was a thing of beauty and I wanted it more than anything. The prospect of seeing games on my Genesis that could never have been done alone was quite appealing, but damn was that $300 price tag a nasty barrier. Even with my own job, saving up for it took months. Fortunately, Sega packed in some goodies for all that money. You received an Arcade Classics compilation that had Revenge of Shinobi, Streets of Rage, Golden Axe, and Columns on it, as well as a second disc that had the Shoot 'em Up Soul Feast on it. I was blown away by Cobra Command in the early days, and shortly thereafter stuff like Batman Returns, Rise of the Dragon, Road Avenger, Final Fight, the Terminator, and Sylphid started showing up. It's true that much of the potential of the device went unrealized, but for a stretch of time, I absolutely loved my Sega CD. It felt like you owned a next generation machine, and when the games were good, they were something to be proud of. Ultimately, the Sega CD fizzled and Sega quietly killed it off without ceremony, but for about 2 years, I really enjoyed the hell out of mine. It still has a number of titles I still consider the best the 16-bit generation had to offer. There was nothing quite like the Streets of Rage games on the Sega Genesis. Backed up by a killer soundtrack, all 3 games played great and provided flawless 2-player action. But once Part 3 was done and released, the series just stopped. There was nothing on the Saturn or Dreamcast to take its place, and even Sega's arcade polygon brawler Spike Out didn't come home until an Xbox sequel in 2005. It wasn't that Sega didn't have the opportunity to do another Streets of Rage, they just never went forward with any of the ideas that came up. It also wasn't a case of the genre being unappealing, because games like Die Hard Arcade and Three Dirty Dwarves were both developed by Sega after Streets of Rage 3, with the latter even using 2-dimensional sprites and backgrounds. For well over 20 years, Streets of Rage sat dormant to many a Sega fan's disappointment. That was until 2020 when Streets of Rage finally made its triumphant return. Part 4 here was made under collaboration between .emu, Lizard Cube, and Guard Crush Games, which meant again that Sega had given an unused IP to new creators to bring it back to life. And much like Sonic Mania, the results were quite compelling. The gameplay took on a combo-heavy focus that was shored up by enemies that could block, use new weapons, and 4-player co-op. Unlockable characters gave you gameplay from every one of the previous games, and a retro filter allowed you to make it look similar as well. I thoroughly enjoyed this release and hope that Sega continues to allow new developers a shot at their unused stable of classic IPs. Owning a Saturn had some serious ups and downs. After the early US launch and the arrival of the PlayStation, it was clear that Sega had a heck of a fight on its hands. But as 1995 came to a close, Sega dropped not 1, not 2, but 3 legendary Saturn releases upon fans that were unsure of its future. Virtua Fighter 2, Sega Rally, and Virtua Cop were 3 releases that really showed the Saturn in a brand new light. Whereas the original Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA had struggled mightily in the visuals department, these new games were orders of magnitude better. Hell, I'd even say they looked like they were on a different machine. While all 3 made certain sacrifices from their Model 2 originals, you still had to admire the huge uptick in visual quality. They were smoother, ran at better resolutions, and had much improved texture and geometry work. 1995 really was my favorite holiday season with the Saturn. 3 Model 2 classics at home about as solid as I could have wanted them. It gave me a newfound sense of hope for my Saturn that going forward we were gonna see some interesting games. I was right too. Sega kept making the stuff I wanted to play. Virtua Cop 2, Fighters Megamix, Dragon Force, Last Bronx, and many others would come out afterwards, all of them among my favorite games for the platform.
Very long easy left. Checkpoint. Medium left. Medium left, baby.
When the Genesis launched in North America back in 1989, it had a 3-button controller that I thought was okay, but wasn't particularly smitten with. It was a tad too large, and there really weren't any standout features to set it apart from the other pads on the market. When word came that the Genesis would get its very own Street Fighter II, those 3 buttons on the face just weren't gonna cut it anymore. Sega then proceeded to release one of the most prolific 2D controllers of all time, the 6-button arcade pad. Now smaller, leaner, and with 6 buttons on its face, you were fully loaded to kick some serious butt in any fighting game that supported it. The directional pad was flawless. Raised just enough to rock quarter, half, and full circles with ease, you rarely missed a move. It was also one of the most comfortable controllers I have ever held. It was curved to perfection and even had a backwards compatible mode for problematic software, leaving very few games that could not benefit from its design. So incredible was the arcade pad, Sega would use it for the basis for the Sega Saturn controller the following year, touching up the shape and adding shoulder buttons, but leaving the directional pad and face buttons virtually untouched. I loved this controller and never looked back after I got one. I was gutted when Sega didn't include them with the US Genesis Mini I picked up. That just made no sense at all. I don't usually put much stock in retro boxes like the Genesis Mini, but the Astro City Mini was a huge release for me. Sega has ignored so much of its arcade history over the years, and to finally get a product that celebrated it was huge. It even included stuff like Dark Rift, Revenge of Death Adder, and Virtua Fighter, games that have never been released in their original arcade forms before. The emulation was mostly solid too, and Sega even made an arcade USB stick and control pads for it. But it wasn't necessarily the device itself that was important here, it was the games. After years of sitting on some of these, Sega finally showed awareness that its customers wanted them. I have no idea if it sold well, but I hope it generated enough interest to keep Sega looking at its older properties and doing more releases like this in the future. Who knows, maybe it will eventually be a case where we will finally get those Model 2 and Model 3 arcade compilations we all want. And speaking of Model 2 and Model 3 games, one of my most beloved Sega eras was their arcade run from about 1994 to 1998. It was during this stretch of time that Sega did perhaps its best work. This was when everything from Daytona USA, Virtua Fighter, Sega Rally, Virtua Cop, House of the Dead, Gunblade New York, Star Wars Trilogy, and Harley Davidson and the LA Riders were born. The quality of these titles never wavered, never let me down, and gave me and my friends countless hours of joy. Sega AM1, AM2, AM3, and a few others were on fire, releasing killer hit after hit in arcades across the globe. It seemed like every single time you walked into an arcade back then, Sega had something new to see and play. Few of these titles actually made their way home, and while that itself was disappointing, it just made the arcade experience that much more special. Say what you want about Sega's console run, but their arcade output was second to none. If you haven't played these games, be sure to find an emulator that can. You're missing some of gaming's absolute best titles.
300, long easy left. 200, long medium left. Water. 150, cross, flat, down, water.
After the Dreamcast was dropped, I really didn't know where Sega was gonna go. They were out of the hardware business and it was gonna take some time to make the switch to the other platforms. Eventually, they'd start releasing games for the GBA, PS2, and GameCube, but it was their original Xbox lineup that really hit home. It was here that we got the great OTOGI series, GUNVALKYRIE, and sequels to Toe Jam and Earl and Crazy Taxi. Sega Sports kept up its prolific rise as a force to be reckoned with, and it looked better here than it did anywhere else. There was also a new House of the Dead, a new PANZER DRAGOON, and my favorite arcade game of all time, Outrun 2, originated on hardware based on the Xbox. You may have heard that many of the Sega faithful kinda saw the Xbox as a Dreamcast 2, and it's not far from the truth. Sega really did double down and release some of their most anticipated titles here, stuff that never appeared on the competition at the time. There was even a handful of Sonic games if that was your thing. Sega even released the gorgeous PANZER DRAGOON Orta themed console, one of the few items I still desire for my collection. It's true that the PlayStation 2 got more Sega games overall, but it was their Xbox library that I appreciated the most. Much like the episode 10 times Sega really let me down, your list here is going to be pretty different from mine. Our taste in games, when we played them, and who we played them with is going to have a huge impact on what we choose. But again, that's what makes sharing all these opinions so great with one another. It truly is interesting to hear how certain games, systems, and peripherals influenced our feelings. Sometimes what made me happy may have crushed some of you. I am also considering doing a viewer edition of this episode as well, so please feel free to share your own list down in the comments. It's true that Sega could drive you crazy with their choices both back then and today, but when they did something you loved, you just never forgot it. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.